In this final lesson, what we're going to do is look at informal fallacies. So in the last lesson, we examined what a logical fallacy looks like. We looked at three particular examples of a logical fallacy. We looked at the masked man fallacy. We looked at the argument from fallacy, and then we looked at the argument from probability. All these things relate to the structure of an argument, why the structure of an argument may cause it to be invalid. In this lesson, we're going to look at more informal fallacies. Okay, these are the fallacies that people often commit most of the time in an argument. And if you can understand these fallacies, if you could understand where to identify them, then you could probably bring down about 60% of all the arguments that are ever made in any kind of debate, whoever you are. Okay, so let's look at some. So, like we've already mentioned, that these fallacies relate to the soundness of an argument, whether or not the premises are true or not. Because people, when they make arguments, they assume the truth value of their premises, but they're often doing that on very shaky grounds. And these fallacies can show why premises are false, effectively. So the first one is the divine fallacy. This is sometimes also known as the argument from incredulity. And it basically assumes that just because something is incredible or amazing or, so complex, that it therefore must be the result of some superior divine power. This can also be extended to any kind of alien or paranormal agency. And in philosophy, this is something that is beyond the scope of this course, but in philosophy we have something called the teleological argument. And the teleological argument can sometimes be seen as falling victim to this fallacy. So effectively what the teleological argument assumes is that because the universe is so perfect and so complex, okay, and is just perfect for human life, it must therefore be the result of divine intervention. It must have a creator. And one example of this is an argument made by someone called William Paley, where he said if you were to walk up a grassy knoll and you were to see a pocket watch on the floor, and you were to pick it up, you would assume that because of the complexity of the watch, the way it's perfect, the way all the different parts, the intricate parts fit together, you would assume that this watch didn't just come out of nowhere, spontaneously come out of nowhere. It was designed and it had a designer. And basically he says that the universe is just as complex and just as perfect as a pocket watch, for example, and so therefore if you were going to assume that a pocket watch has a designer, then you should also assume that the universe has a designer, therefore God exists. Okay, that's the argument, the teleological argument for the existence of God. And you could argue that it is subject to the divine fallacy, that just because something is amazing, incredible, or perfect, or complicated, you can then say, well, that must mean it's a result of some higher power. The second fallacy, probably in my opinion, the one that is committed almost on a daily basis by everyone from philosophers to politicians, this is the fallacy of composition. So a person who is committing the fallacy of composition is somebody who is, if you are committing this fallacy, they are making an assumption about a group of people based on the characteristics of individual members. So you see one or two people who are associated with a group are doing one thing, therefore the group as a whole has to be doing that thing as well. A very good example, this is applied to both ends of the political spectrum, by the way. It's applied to different groups on one side of the political spectrum, and this is exactly the same on the other side. So, good example, just because some men have committed violence in the past, that doesn't mean all men as a group are violent. And the same can be said for women, the same can be said for anybody or anything, or animals, anything at all. So this is what the fallacy of composition suggests, is that your attitudes towards a particular group of people are informed by the actions of individual members of that group. And that is something that is fallacious. You can't make an argument suggesting that all men are violent, and then to support that evidence, to support that premise, you say, well, look at these individual people who have committed violent crime in the past. That's not how, that would make it a fallacious premise. We also have the fallacy of false equivalence. This is also one that is used very often in the world in political arguments. This is describing two or more statements as virtually equal when they're not. So, for example, this is one relating to the false equivalence of properties. So, both Adolf Hitler and Mother Teresa had hair, therefore they're both the same. Now you can see very clearly, oopsie daisy, you can see very, very clearly why this is a fallacious premise, that this doesn't make sense. Okay, just because they had this single property, these statements doesn't mean that they're the same, or they should be equivocated. This is a false equivalence. We also have what we call a fallacious appeal to authority. Now, appealing to authority is not necessarily a bad thing. When we talk about appealing to authority, if I wanted to make an argument about physics, for example, it might be completely valid to appeal to an expert in physics or a series of experts in physics to back up my point. Okay, that's not a fallacious argument. What would be a fallacious appeal to authority is where we use an expert of dubious credentials or only use one opinion to promote a particular idea. More interestingly as well, using an expert in one field and simply by virtue of them being an expert in something, suggesting that we can use that authority to prove a point in a different field. So generally what most people do is, if you were to have an argument with someone and you were to suggest that Professor X of the University of Y says that that's false, okay, they would instantly come back at you and say, no, that's an appeal to authority. But that's not necessarily fallacious. It's not necessarily fallacious to argue that as somebody of a particular standard and of a particular expert in a field may be qualified to talk on this issue. What a fallacious appeal to authority is using an expert of what we call dubious credentials, so using an expert that may not be actually an expert, or not be an expert in the field that we're talking about, or only referring to one particular expert when there is a whole field of other experts that are possibly saying another thing. So if we were to have if we were to look at physics, for example, and let's say one professor of physics says that time travel is possible, and then the other million or so other physics professors in the world say it's impossible, it would be a fallacious appeal to authority to just refer to the one opinion to suggest that time travel is possible, when all these other opinions say that it is not. Let's look at an example of someone using a fallacious appeal to authority by referring to an expert in a different field. So let's have a look at Dave, who is the professor of chemistry at the University of Oxford. Just a random name. And Dave says that the Russian Revolution happened in 1650. Therefore, because Dave is an expert, Professor Dave is an expert, the Russian Revolution happened in 1650. This is a fallacious appeal to authority. Just because somebody is an expert in chemistry doesn't mean that they have the authority to talk on issues, matters of history in this example. In this example, the Russian Revolution was in 1917, not 1650. We can also commit the fallacy of constructing an audience. This is one that is also, most of these are all very heavily used. This one is also one that is heavily used as well. And it's more of a rhetorical trick. It's more of a way to get more people to support your argument. This is by suggesting that an argument is true by saying that lots of people agree with it. Okay, let's take this premise here. Lots of people argue that the Earth is flat, or some people argue that the Earth is flat. You suggest that people agree with you, and the assumption there is, if these people agree with you, then this argument is true. And you're not naming particular people. That's why we call it constructing an audience. We are constructing these people who agree with me to suggest that my argument is true. This is obviously a fallacy. Argument from emotion, okay, commonly referred to, and it's a very let's take this very interesting example. It's not a very difficult one to get our heads around. If you were a lawyer, how could you defend a murderer? How would you feel if they murdered your mother? Now, this is a very emotionally driven sentiment. Okay, the point of this line of reasoning that this person is, this question is trying to, bring about, is it's trying to inhibit an emotional reaction, and it's not trying to look at a rational one or a logical one. You're appealing to somebody's emotions by trying to bring their mother into the argument. Therefore, it is an argument from emotion. Another one is, how would you feel if this happened? How would you do, what if it was your daughter, or what if it was... These are all arguments, okay, that seem rhetorically effective, but in reality, they are not rational or logical in any way. They're just appealing to this person's emotion. Similar to an appeal to an emotion is also the argumentum ad hominem, okay? This is basically where you respond to an argument with a personal attack. And you suggest that a valid response to an argument is just to personally attack them. For example, Dave says, "I think the Earth is flat." That is the proposition, the premise that he's referring to. And Tom replies, "Well, I think you're stupid." This is an argumentum ad hominem. Okay, Tom doesn't actually engage with the argument itself. He doesn't engage with whether or not the premise is true or not. He just goes straight to an ad hom attack, and this doesn't make a difference to the integrity of Dave's argument. It's just a bit mean. We also have the naturalistic fallacy. And this is really where what we do is assume that something is moral or immoral, or right and wrong, just because it is the case that that thing happens in nature. So a very good example here is, eating meat is moral because animals do it all the time. Now, while eating meat is obviously a debated topic within philosophy, to suggest that we could say that eating meat is moral just because animals do it doesn't prove that it is a moral thing, okay? Because just because it happens in nature doesn't mean it's morally right or morally wrong. That's what the naturalistic fallacy is arguing. The final one I want to look at before we end this course is the argumentum tu quoque. It is Latin for you two, and it's basically stating that a position is false or wrong or should be disregarded because the proponent of that proposition, the person who is saying the proposition, fails to act in accordance with it. Okay? So a good example here is, person A claims that X is true. Premise 1. Premise 2, person B asserts that A's actions or past claims are inconsistent with the truth of X. Therefore, X is false. This is a fallacious tu quoque fallacy. Take another example. If Dave were to tell you to stop smoking, and Tom were to reply, "Well, you smoke all the time," this is not a good way of responding to the argument, because it doesn't actually engage with whether or not Tom should stop smoking. It is just suggesting that Dave's past actions or past conduct is inconsistent with his position here, which is that he should stop smoking. Okay, there are a great deal of other informal fallacies, and a number of other ones are listed in the notes document for this course. And if you've enjoyed this course, please give a good review, and don't forget to try some of the problem questions for this course to see if you've really got to grip with all of the kind of arguments and the logical reasoning that we've discussed. In further courses, what we're going to do is look at propositional logic in a little bit more detail, look at applying these rules to actual logical examples, and using things like reductio ad absurdum to come to some more in detailed logical arguments.